Thank you, and welcome everybody. I am Patrick Reyes. I'm the VP of this fine organization and incoming program chair. This is just a reminder. If you've missed any of the pieces, some great sessions we've had, you can always come back here to the website and see all the recordings on Run the World. Are we ready for the presidential address? I don't know if we are. I want to see some comments up in this thing like, I'm ready for this. Drop a comment in here, say, I'm ready. I want to see that you're ready. I don't see anyone ready. I see some clapping. There we go. Cal Keith Perry's ready. Mary's ready. Norma's ready. Karen's ready. Come on, Meritocracy Show. We're ready. All right. Look, last night as fireworks went off, there was this artificial wonder. I was reflecting on how dumb dudes are. The majority of 15,000 people are injured in the U.S. every day or every 4th of July due to fireworks. Are men trying to bring artificial wonder to the world. And then around midnight, the real show started where I am. These beautiful clouds raised over the mountains and lightning came pouring down. Powerful, fierce, brilliant, lighting up the sky. A wonder that does not need anything artificial. It's not pretending, almost declaring to the disruptive, male, and largely artificial sky just hours earlier that I am here and I am the real deal. Reverend Dr. Lee is the real deal to me. She is that lightning. She's the lightning in my life, lighting up the sky, reminding us that the power that comes directly from the heavens, from skies above, from the ancestors, bringing power down to our people to the very ground. And I am blessed to introduce her using her own words, exploring where this power came from. And I want to share a piece from an interview I recently did with her for the Forum for Theological Exploration. And she was a guest on our podcast. So if we could cue up that little.
I was in charge of a preschool and the young adult group. And most of my young adults were factory workers with a high school education. And my preschool kids, majority of their parents even had to work on Sundays. So Sunday, we had to bring them to church, wash their face, comb their hair, and even feeding breakfast. So when I went to bring those kids to church and I saw their living conditions, that some of them didn't have running water. And in January in Seoul, it's like a Chicago. Some of them didn't even have a heat. So I went there to give back out of my guilt. But having been in that church context, later I realized that they completely transformed my life, because these who are not claiming as Minjung theologians, but they are the Minjung. They were just the living words of God to me, because most of their homes were built on government land illegally as urban poor. And Korean military government decided to evacuate them and build a high-rise apartment complex right before Olympics. So it was like a matter of life and death for them. And then they invited me to join them, in their fight to keep their home. So for me, even though I was aware of, exposed and committed to Minjung theology, when they asked me to join them, it was a pastoral call, not my political call.
That's just a reminder that this year's theme is a pastoral call. It's not a political call. This is a reminder that we're gathered today because, as we just heard from this last session, that we need to think about these issues in our various communities. And I'm so blessed and honored to be the one to welcome Boyung Lee, a native of Korea, Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dean of the Faculty, Professor of Practical Theology at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, ordained United Methodist clergy, served churches in Korea, California, Massachusetts, Connecticut. She's first Korean-American woman academic dean, Association of Theological Schools in the United States and Canada. She was, for 15 years, she was at Pacific School of Religion and GTU in Berkeley, where she became the first woman of color to receive tenure in 2007. She's also affiliated scholar at the University of California, Riverside, Religion and Sexual Abuse Project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation for the next 4 years. And for us, she's the program chair and my president of the Religious Education Association, Boyung. So if you're ready, drop some love in those comments and welcome her. Sound the applause. Welcome, Boyung.
Thank you, Patrick. It was a mistake to to ask you to be the moderator of this session, although it was by default as a next program chair. So thank you so much for such heartwarming, profoundly generous introduction. And colleagues and friends, I'm just profoundly touched to share this space with you. So thank you. And I know that this is one of the few academic guilds where I can make some mistakes, but my colleagues hold me gently and remind me of things that I need to keep working on. So thank you for being colleagues the way that you have been. And thank you for being here this evening too. As a disclaimer, as Patrick said as part of my introduction, I'm a Christian and I'm also an United Methodist ordained clergy. And my context has been both in Asia and Korea, but particularly, United States and Asia, among Korea, that these are two most familiar contexts. So my address tonight will be very much influenced by the context that I live in and work in. Also, I apologize to those of you who read Religious Education Journal, the conference issue, my short essay. So because I will incorporate a part of that essay that I wrote for the conference issue. So forgive me for repeating what you already have read. So let me share my screen here. Okay, share and play from. Okay. So during my first year as a full-time faculty at the Pacific School of Religion and Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, I was standing in the middle of a class, my own class, feeling completely lost. We were covering the subject of who of religious education, which included identity and power in education. However, during my lecture, several students started screaming and shouting as they noticed that one of their peers appeared to have a seizure in the middle of the class. Several of us created a space for the student not to be hurt until paramedics arrived, and I invited the other students to take a break. A few minutes later, she stopped shaking and felt well enough to sit on her chair. When the paramedics arrived, she refused to go to an emergency room with them, insisting that she was okay. She also declined my invitation to go back to her dorm room and rest. Then she burst into tears, almost shouting at me, "Why are you making us talk about identity and power? It is nothing to do with the religious education. This class terrifies me." I did not expect to be triggered to relive my trauma at a religious education class. Other students and I tried to calm her down unsuccessfully, but she went on and on, almost wailing. Still today, I do not remember how I wrapped up the class. All I remember is a feeling utterly lost. Later, I learned through many conversations that she's a survivor of intimate childhood violence by a family member and sexual assaults by an authority figure in her faith community. Thanks to many years of therapy and her determination, she was able to put her life together. However, she would sometimes be triggered by certain words and behaviors associated with her traumatic memories. When that happened, she would have anxiety attacks, often in a seizure form, and emotional distress, as she did in my class. This episode happened during my very early teaching career as a theological educator in the United States. It's one of the many moments that challenged me to grow further through critical self-examinations about my assumptions as a heterosexual, cisgender, married woman of color. When this incident happened, I used to think that I was very well prepared to teach gender and sexuality related topics. Beyond my degree in religion and education, which included a rigorous coursework in gender studies by my choice, following my mentor Kwak Hui Lan's advice that beyond my degree, because of who I am as a woman of Asian heritage. White Academy assumes I know everything about my culture and people, and therefore not doing injustice to my people by essentializing such vast and rich cultural heritages and identities, I need to have at least minimum a PhD level of knowledge in my own culture and identity. So I did. I also had 7 years of full-time pastoral ministry experiences and 9 years of youth ministry work behind me by then. I thought that I had seen everything from my encounters and pastoral work with my parishioners, like couples struggling with pornography addictions in their marriage, parishioners engaging in polyamorous relationships, a church leader's suicidal attempt due to her long suppressed unmatching gender identity, a youth member with mental breakdowns from the resurfaced memory of childhood sexual assaults by his grandfather, which was dismissed by his own parents, and father finding his daughter's picture in a strip club flyer, and many others. While learning to be their spiritual leader by closely walking with them in their struggles to reconcile their belief systems and gender and sexuality, I realized how much more education I needed beyond my PhD seminar courses in gender studies. Although these were the issues around which some of my parishioners had their deepest struggles, we hardly talked about it as a community of faith. Not only the subject of gender and sexuality, we did not talk about even more fundamental human matters like bodies and sex. As Christians, we confess that we are created in God's image. However, by not talking and teaching about the human body and sexuality, we implicitly taught ourselves and others about non-holistic ways of being God's people. Sex, sexuality, gender identity. These are inseparable part of who we are. Yet the least taught, discussed the topic in theological and religious classrooms and faith communities. Religious studies scholar Mathilde K. Morris analyzes, traditionally, the subject of sexuality has been avoided. She notes when students are asked when they have heard a leader addresses sexuality directly in worship, in a sermon, in a class, or in a camp training, most answer never. However, Morris observes that through a via negativa of sorts, sexuality has been taught from the pulpit, in schools of training, in religious institutions that teach history, scripture, and pastoral care, and through theology itself as it issues prohibitions, affirms worldviews, negates people's humanity, and silences or forces a submission or outright rejection of people who do not fit the accepted norm. Similarly, Katia Moles, a scholar of religious sex education, notes that despite a theoretical separation of church and state in the United States, a particular Christian ethic which holds sex to be sinful outside of patriarchal heterosexual marriage influences U.S. public institutions, schools, policies, and attitudes related to sexuality today. After analyzing most of the available public school sex education curricula, she concludes that many programs emphasize abstinence, sex as dangerous, and gender, sexual, and racial stereotypes. Both Morris and Moles studies show that the sex-negative approach of religious institutions are shaping the public education's approach, and in turn, the public education reinforces students to further internalize the abstinence and sex-negative values consciously and unconsciously. As a result of such curriculum-based sex education in the U.S. secular and religious context, Morris argues that avoiding how human sexuality has been interpreted by the church through time has led to a crisis of institutional and larger faith proportions. Avoiding ethical problems related to abuse of power, sexual abuse, domestic violence, sexual hierarchies of power divided by gender and sexuality, and other issues related to sexual violence has not prepared the pastors and theological and religious studies faculty well for their work. A case in point, I am an ordained United Methodist clergy person, as I said and Patrick said, the largest mainline Protestant denomination in the world. I teach at the Iliff School of Theology, which is one of the 13 United Methodist theological schools in the U.S. This church and that I and my institution belong is about to split over unreconcilable differences on human sexuality, particularly the ordination of LGBTQIA plus members. We also hear nonstop news about sexual abuse cases by political and religious leaders, increasing hate crimes against the people with non-heteronormative gender identities, by people who invoke their religious beliefs as a justification for their violence. You may wonder why these problems are more frequently surfacing these days. I would say that these issues have always been our religious and higher education institutions and in our world. However, in my opinion, and also according to analysis of some of the gender and sexuality studies scholars, this is a result of a long-lived tension between hypermasculine developmentalism, post-hypermasculine developmentalism, and resurging hypermasculine developmentalism. What does it mean? Hypermasculinity is a sociological term denoting exaggerated forms of masculinity, virility, and physicality. It is an overemphasis and exaggerated adherence to the traditional male gender roles established by traditional societal view, often backed by dominant religious values of that society. R.W. Connell and James Messerschmitt, prominent sociologists of gender studies from Australia, suggest that hegemonic masculinity is heterosexual, aggressive and comparative and homosocial, meaning excluding women from its social networks, and that it also emphasizes hierarchy and the capacity to dominate other men. In other words, hypermasculinity is believed to develop in a culture of fear for anything that is feminine, and is often associated with aggression towards women and other men who violate the traditional gender norm. There are multiple forms of masculinity, including hegemonic masculinity, complicit masculinity, subordinated masculinity, marginalized masculinity, militarized masculinity, female masculinity. Among these different types of masculinity, those few men who embody the most archaic forms of masculinity, that is hypermasculinity, are seen as leaders, and others who do not fit into the mold of hypermasculinity are at the bottom. Similarly, masculinity studies scholar Michael Kimmel observes that hegemonic masculinity in the U.S. culture is defined in opposition to various groups of others, such as women, racial minorities, and sexual minorities. In other words, the socially constructed notion of what it means to be a real man is defined in opposition to different groups of the others. Hegemonic masculinity is defined in relation to women, cisgender heterosexual women, lesbians and transgender women, as well as in relation to gay men, transgender men, immigrant men of color. Because what constitutes a hegemony is an idea that embeds certain notions of consent and participation by the subaltern groups, hegemonic masculinity, which is not normal in the statistical sense, because the number of men who enact is very small, is deemed normative. Even if the majority of the male populations of a given society do not enact the hegemonic masculinity, they and others tend to accept it as the way man should be or what a real man is supposed to be like or act like. To illustrate how this hegemonic masculinity is at work in contemporary industrial and global capitalistic society and why it is in tension with emerging human rights thoughts and movements, including gender justice work like the Me Too movements, Black Lives Matter movements, I find the concept of a hypermasculine developmentalism and post-hypermasculine developmentalism, coined and used by several Asian and Asian American or Asian European scholars, extremely insightful. According to M. Lily Ling, a Chinese American scholar of international affairs, the rapid economic development of East Asian countries such as Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, and Singapore is a result of a Confucian patriarchy combined with assigned gender roles for comparative labor market in a global context. She defines hypermasculine developmentalism as a state system that assumes all the rights and privileges of a classical Confucian patriarchy, that is Confucian hegemonic masculinity, for the state, while assigning to society the characteristics of a classical womanhood, such as diligence, discipline, and deference. Society subsequently bears the burden of economic development without equal access to political representation or voice. Regarding this, Nami Kim, a Korean-American feminist theologian teaching at Spelman College in Atlanta, says that in South Korea, a country that was one of the poorest countries 60 years ago, but now is the 11th largest economy in the world, hypermasculine developmentalism period from 1970s through 1990s, and the gendered process of industrialization through the gendered division of labor ensured to keep women workers in unequal subordinate work positions. Women's unpaid labor in the domestic sphere has also been viewed as normal. Hypermasculine developmentalism in South Korea could not have been made possible without the patriarchal feminism and gender system that naturalized women's labor as different from men's, which justified the pay inequality in the case of women workers and no compensation for women's household labor. Women's labor in the workforce was undervalued and unequally compensated, whereas women's work at home was taken for granted and overlooked. The South Korean state played a key role in constructing modern gender subjects and the contemporary patriarchal nuclear family during the hypermasculine developmentalism period. Such a patriarchal family system and the modern gendered division of labor, in turn, have contributed to sustaining hypermasculine developmentalism. This example of South Korea is similarly happening in many other developing countries in the global South now, and communities of color in global North countries, including the United States. However, with a neoliberal global economy, proliferations of various rights movements, the burgeoning of civil organizations, and the rise of middle-class consumer citizens, internet, liberalization of overseas travel, and many other contributing facts have exposed the contradictions and complications of hypermasculine developmentalism. The contradictions and problems of hypermasculine developmentalism were uncovered in various areas like welfare systems, access to education, and unequal distribution of wealth among social constituencies, racial discriminations, gender-based violence, and many others. Kim calls this new period that challenges the hypermasculine developmentalism post-hypermasculine developmentalism. However, even though a society is in this post-hypermasculine developmentalism stage, traits and characteristics of a hypermasculine developmentalism continues to linger in social, political, and economic spheres, like we live in both modern and postmodern society with the colonial and post-colonial legacies at the same time. Although not in everywhere, but very commonly, the religious right of a society emerges as a social and political force to reinvigorate the declining power and influence of a hegemonic masculinity in post-hypermasculine developmentalism stage. This religious right, along with the political right, see emerging human rights movements as a threat to the natural God-given social order and national security crisis, and thus condemn them often with the anti-communist and socialist languages. White Christian nationalism of the United States is a powerful example of this. Kim also lists a common set of core beliefs shared among the religious and political right as following: the inerrancy of the sacred text of the dominant religion, condemnation of certain issues and groups such as homosexuality, sexual morals, religious pluralism, and equity-based gender roles and relations. In the gender theology subscribed by the religious right, women's subordination in the family, the religious institution like the church, and the society is believed to be natural, as was the case in the original order of God's creation as they interpret it, and you see why Christian nationalism has such strong political basis in the United States. Kim argues that what is at stake with the Christian right is a gendered system of theology in which women are primarily in charge of their family's relationship with God, whereas men, especially fathers, represent God the Father and the historical Mary Christ. This gendered theological system not only consolidates a hierarchical gender order and the heterosexual family as a normative, but it also reflects and prescribes attitudes about the gender of God. Because the religious right's gendered theology works in relation to its attempts to redefine and reassert the hegemonic masculinity, a key to maintaining the patriarchal structure in the religious institution and the wider society, emerging human rights movements in post-hypermasculine developmentalism in global context becomes a significant and serious threat to them. Kim summarizes that hegemonic masculinity that supported hypermasculine developmentalism renders men who do not fit hegemonic masculine configuration as a subordinated or marginalized. The collective voices and presence of individuals and communities, including LGBTQIA people and feminists, who do not conform to hegemonic masculinity are viewed as great challenges to hierarchical gender and order and relations. Women's sexual preference over other women over men, or women who do not conform to emphasize the femininity means men's lack of control over women's bodies and lives. These are deemed dangerous. Similarly, gay men cannot be tolerated because they destabilize hegemonic masculinity that demands men to assume the role of the leader and protector of their wives and children in a heterosexual two-parent family. Both men and women who are sexually attracted to and have sexual relationship with those who share the same sex are a threat to hegemonic masculinity. With the neoliberal global market system, this resurgence of a hypermasculine developmentalism based on hegemonic masculinity is now happening in a global context. Highly masculinized global business capitalism and the highly feminized forms of employment for cheaper labor market in global south reinforces heteronormative hegemonic masculine systems throughout the world, including by stronger global south countries against their poor neighbors like Chinese labor exploitations in Tibet. Then what do we religious education scholars and practitioners do in this context? Whether we feel comfortable to discuss the subject or not because of our ill-prepared feelings, theological stance, or something else, gender and sexuality issues, concerns are right at our front door or already inside of our house and classroom. According to the 2019 U.S. Department of Justice statistical reports on crimes, every 73 seconds, another American is sexually assaulted. Putting it differently, 1 out of every 6 American women and 1 in 33 American men have been victims of an attempt or completed a sexual assault in their lifetime. This means that people who live with the trauma from exposure to gender and sexually based violence are prevalent in our society. This situation is even more serious in higher education. 26.4% of females, that is over 1 in 4, and 6.8% of males, that is 1 in 15, among U.S. undergrad students experienced sexual assaults in 2019. Referencing these statistics, Stephanie Crumpton, a womanist pastoral theologian, says, it is not uncommon for people who have experienced a sexual assault to be present in any classroom in an institution of higher learnings, including theological and religious studies classrooms. The trouble is that few educators have been exposed to resources beyond their discipline that would prepare them to navigate the emotional intensity that becomes palpable in the classroom as students voice the trauma of a sexual assault directly, indirectly, personally, and collectively. And as I shared in the beginning, I was one of those teachers. As Darrell Stevens and Kay Dott, who are actually presenting at this year's REA, says in their very recently published co-edited volume, Teaching Sexuality and Religion in Higher Education. Sexuality is an especially challenging topic for theological and religious studies classrooms because they are so personal, embodied, culturally dependent, political, and moralized. They also point out that attitudes about sexuality are often bound up in issues of shame, guilt, power, and freedom. Rates of childhood and adult sexual abuse are staggering, yet open dialogue about sexuality is conspicuously silenced in many religious and theological contexts. As the aforementioned statistics show that it is very likely that we have people with sexual violence experiences or sexual discriminations are present in our own classroom, and what and how are we religious educators are helping them. After I announced the theme of this conference in 2019 in Toronto, I was approached got a few emails from colleagues that I am promoting my biased political agenda as a feminist scholar. Well, that may be the case. However, my motivation for choosing this theme is how do we address these pressing yet ignored issues in our teaching and ministry context? So I want us to ask together what and how we teach about being a holistic and religious person in an age of a global pandemic that heightens domestic violence, Me Too movement, and churches' sexual scandals, conflicts, and divisions of religious institutions over human sexuality. Multiple fields of colleagues in multiple fields have done a great deal of critical research on gender and sexuality. In general, and on sexual violence, trauma, and healing, LGBTQIA+, and queer studies in particular. Through my work with the colleagues in other fields, however, I find that there are critical gaps in their work that often do not recognize the importance of religion in human formation. Or among religion scholars who delve into gender and sexuality, many of them are focused on exposing the grim reality of sexual violence done by religions, and there is a serious lack at constructive pedagogical suggestions and guidance for our individual teaching, church, and religious institutions. Therefore, I am particularly excited to engage with my fellow religious education colleagues this week that puts religions and pedagogy together at the center. I'm confident and hopeful that we can generate new insights and pedagogical suggestions for our own religious institutions in struggles and people who need our wisdom as we share ideas on the following and many other issues. How to help facilitate informed conversations on often avoided, misunderstood, or contentious topics related to sexuality and gender identities. How to confront institutionally suppressed recognition of sexual and gendered violence to open a way for just healing. How to create the space of healing and restore the wholeness of people and communities from trauma. Stevens and Ott, in their edited volume, offer 3 critical strategies in teaching sexuality and religion together. First, perspective transformation. Second, embodied learning. And third, trauma sensitivity. Perspective transformation is intended to increase moral awareness and empathy for other viewpoints by teaching students how context, experience, and knowledge shape morals, attitudes, and practices. Embodied learning enhances the perspective transformation approach, which can be misconstrued as a solely cognitive enterprise by emphasizing the full physical, social, cultural, bodily, and psychological context in which a person lives and learns. Trauma-sensitive pedagogy develops awareness of the psychological, social, and theological implications of a sexual assault on the learner, instructor, and classroom environment. Personally, I have taught classes like Engender Pedagogy, which is a seminar on queer and post-colonial imagination in teaching. Also, I taught Sex in Seminary, which was a class for master students on sex education in religious context. And I also have included gender and human sexuality and queer approaches to religious education in my Introduction to Christian Education and Religious Education class. Teaching these classes, however, I have learned that there is no easy way to address the topic, and students bring their different experiences and readiness for the topic, including their recognized and unrecognized trauma, to their learning space. Therefore, I need to be always conscious of a trauma-informed pedagogy, providing help resources as a part of the class syllabus, utilizing multiple ways of learning, different type of learning modes, including meditations. That these are some of the things I use. I also find using hands-on artwork, using popular media, particularly video clips from comedy that explicitly talks about body and sex and sexuality and gender identity. And I use for Asian American students, Margaret Cho's video, I Am the One That I Want, in which she talks about sexuality very blunt ways, but it's hilarious. So that humor, and because someone else is talking about Asian American sexuality, students tend to open up to talk about it. And here, so I also incorporate mindful breathing as part of my class. And also, I often do anonymous polling in the middle of the class to check where they are. And also, I use a lot of body movement in my teaching. And none of these were not easy ones because I'm such a cognitive, learning-oriented person. But through the years, I learned that these are something that I must incorporate to teach and to learn with my students. The far right is a flyer. After Atlanta shooting that killed 8 people, including 6 women of Asian heritage, a lot of national discussions happened whether this was hate crimes or this is racism or this is a sexism. And the conclusion that as an Asian American woman scholar that I, without any hesitation, says is it is a sexually motivated or racially motivated racism and hate crimes. But unfortunate situation is that some of the Asian American churches based in Atlanta refuse to participate in commemoration public events for those victims because the misinformation about some of the victims are presumably have a connection to sex work industry. And so evangelical purity culture of the perpetrator and that evangelical purity culture of the victims' communities are at work at the same time. So how do I talk about this racialized sexism and sexualized racism against the Asian American women? And I'm working with colleagues in Denver, artists, to co-curate an art exhibit of 10 Asian American women artists whose work we are bringing from all over the country to exhibit in Denver for months as a way of a public education of gender and sexuality and racism. Racism and sexism for women of color are not separated, and thus anti-racist, post-colonial, and intersectional approach is not an option for some of us. Also, even in progressive context, the judgmental statements are made of countries and communities of color in both in United States and Global South. That if there is no friendly LGBTQIA culture is there, it is less civilized culture and context. And these judgments are made by even so-called progressive religious people. So in this context, that also that I bring my own context. The question I have for us to think about is, we are creative teachers, and I have already learned so much from different sessions today to discuss body, sex, and sexuality, gender in a very creative and informative ways. But beyond that, more importantly, what do we do in our own teaching context? And but beyond that, how our collaborative work can be resources and tools for institutional transformation for colleagues in other fields and for the institutions we serve and churches and religious organizations we are part of. So I do not have an answer. And therefore, I'm asking us to engage this question to get collaborative power and some constructive movement as religious educators to bring to our context and world together. Thank you.
Let's all thank Reverend Dr. Lee for the address. Let's see some applause, some love, and we are going to move into a Q&A session. So, Boyung, let me just say thank you for all of that. Now, I want to push one piece before we get into questions that I would love to hear you speak a little bit about. You gave statistics, the 1 in 6. You lifted up Stephanie Crumpton's work, who says students are in our classrooms who are wrestling with this. Religious Education Association is an institution. It's not immune to these things. These numbers are here. They're present with us. These bodies are with us. The trauma, the stories are with us. And I'm wondering how you see the Guild, your research, and the Guild's work going hand in hand. How do we, more than just a conference to talk about it out there in our classrooms, in our churches, in our faith communities, but what about right here? What about with our board, our journal, our event, the way we structure, the way we talk about these things? Tell us a little bit about how you think about institutions like the Religious Education Association.
Since 1903, I think this is the first time that we talk about gender and sexuality explicitly, even though some of us are doing the work, because the rhetoric has been that some of our members who belong to conservative religious denominations and organizations do not feel safe. But so I pushed this theme because without, as I said, I'm not motivated to have a certain political agenda, even though I have my own certain agenda in my own work. But if we are not talking about it when people are suffering and be traumatized, like my student in my own class, in a class that I talked about the participants who of religious education, then when are we going to talk about? Because by not talking about as a guild, and by avoiding or thinking, political correctness, we actually do harm. So I think this year is one of the baby steps that we are explicitly talking about it. And also, in 2019, after I announced the theme, some of our own members, longtime members, came to me and came out to me, and I had no idea. And they came out to me and thanking me for the theme, and because they didn't feel safe to come out in Religious Education Association. And we always say that this is a friendly, non-society. But some of our members had to suppress their important part of who they are.
Thank you. I mean, I think what you're saying is both on the interpersonal level as members, as guilds, as friends, as a community of scholars that we are and practitioners. And there's a very human element. And there's also the structural pieces, that there's something there about going back to 1903 and saying that, over 100 years, 120 years almost, that this organization just has not even addressed this moment, despite what we may think about ourselves. So thank you. I'm going to invite folks to either grab the mic or drop their question in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. And if you want to request the mic and have a question for Reverend Dr. Lee, I'd be happy to pass you the mic. Questions? Questions, concerns? Is everyone just worried about their background not being right? Because you can't blur yourself in this. While I'm waiting for questions, I got another one for you, Boyung. As you think about where the Guild is headed 50 years from now, and you think about the impact of what this session and this annual theme might have, what are your hopes?
I think as a dean, I pay attention to statistics, and especially why younger generations are most spiritual but do not want to be part of institutional religions, right? So we hear that although it's mainly happening in white institutions and still communities of color, that the religious institutions are center and central. But I think because if we do not talk about it, I think our colleagues in coming generations will not find the REA relevant, and they will find the other learned society that does this work. So I think it is a very critical matter as some of us as seniors to nurture our colleagues who are paying attention to this issue, or this is life or death issue.
That's right. I mean, this is absolutely life or death. I think you're setting the pace. We have Lucinda. I'm going to invite Lucinda Huffaker to come up. You have to remember to accept you'll get a prompt with all the things. There we go. Go
Hi,
ahead, Lucinda.
Boyung.
Hi.
And Patrick. Boyung, I'm aware that there are some people who chose not to or couldn't attend this meeting, either because of their personal beliefs, but more so because of their institutions' constraints on their participation. And it reminds me of the difficulties we're having on multiple fronts of dialogue with those who do not see things the way we do. And I'm wondering what kind of guidance you have for us as president, that we want to include people, might be on one hand, we don't want to violate and hurt people on the other hand, and yet our nation's situation has shown us that not talking to each other just leads us down this impossible path. So what wisdom do you see in having those kinds of conversations between such disparate groups in REA? Thank you.
Lucinda, as I said in my talk, I brought this subject because that's where I am heading, because I wanted to for us to think about the ways which that we can handle, because as I said, the religion scholars who do this work is exposing a lot of problems, but there are no constructive or pedagogical framework for us to bring this to the context. So I don't think I have an answer. But one guiding principle for my own scholarship and teaching is that is my own and my community's justice gained at the cost of somebody else's? So that always has been my guiding principle. So that's one question that we need to ask each other. And the other question that I want us to consider is that, why the topic of gender and sexuality is such misunderstood, as if, it is my case, that if we talk about gender and sexuality, we're promoting certain political agenda. And so, because as I said, in my introduction to Christian education class, I had the gender and sexuality as a topic. It's part of who, and also I had a queer approach to religious education. So my own institution at that time, which is a Pacific School of Religion, almost 50% of our students identified themselves as members of LGBTQIA members. And then I teach them how to be a great religious educator, and I never talk about it. What am I doing there? So then I got a lot of resistance from students from conservative because it's part of a GTU that we had also 9 other schools as a member of a GTU. So to address that, one of the ways I did was I asked all of my students to be in small group and choose different ways of approaching religious education, including queer approaches. And when Tony Graham was at the GTU, I also included Orthodox ways of teaching religious education because it's very different, the aesthetic ways. But students had to choose the group other than their own primary identity. So in group work, everyone had to be the other. So as the other, one of their presentation, as part of their presentation, they were required to develop a different version of Peggy McIntosh's white privilege checklist. So in this context, as the other, what checklist what things that I need to be really critically aware of about my assumptions and my cultural biases, all that. So I think that activities significantly helped our resisting students to talk about some of these issues. And I was not accepting them, pushing them to accept it, but they had to understand what's at stake here.
Thank you, Boyung. I just want to remind folks that we have about 7 minutes left before we go, and there will be more time for reflection time at 10:30. So I want to get one last question. I'm going to give the mic to Moonsun. So I'm going to give you a two-parter here. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to give the mic to Moonsun as well. So we have Mary Elizabeth Moore writes, the RA has had some intense concerns about dealing with race as well. Do you think that education as a field and educators, pedagogues, are focused on more gradual change rather than deeply rooted controversies? And while you answer that question, I'm going to invite Moonsun up onto the stage as well.
Thank you, Mary Elizabeth. One of my new pieces is coming out as a part of a teaching in violent extremism, edited by Eliezer Hernandez, and I'm waiting for my own copy. So in it, I talked about different ways of understanding curriculum, different thoughts of a curriculum, traditionalist, revisionist, and then also the conceptualist of understanding of a curriculum. So the reality is that still the majority of schools are our curriculum is based on traditionalist, and even in a revisionist approach is considered to be progressive. So I ponder and I wrestle, how do we bring this conceptualist approach to curriculum to the center so that the race and gender and sexuality is not side topics, but it's at the core of what we teach and who we are as a central driving force of our curriculum.
That's right. Think about it. The bodies that we teach are actually front and center for what we teach. I've invited Dr. Moonsun. You should be able. Okay, we got you.
Thank you so much. I'm very appreciate Dr. Boyung Lee's presidential address. So basically, I think gender identity between male and female are very important in phase for development and growth. However, any person worry about and criticize strengthen of gender the gender identities strengthens the gender conflict between male and female. For example, a few days ago in Korea, a man in difficult situation in subway. However, many men bypassing her or worrying about sexual harassment in order to avoid the misunderstanding of sexual harassment. How do you think about such situations and gender identities and gender conflict? the relationship.
So one of my thank you, Dr. Son, and because I read the Korean newspaper every day, and I am gravely worried about very misunderstood the feminist movement in Korea, and especially the politicians, media are creating conflicts between men and women, and so there is no concept of equity, but based on the concept of equality, the women who do not do everything that men do are like a social harm. And so there's a lot of attacks on women or feminists. And also that a lot of women also misunderstanding feminist as a male-hating movement rather than solidarity movement to bring justice to all. That is happening too. So, Dr. Sun, I don't have an answer, but I think the concern is why politicians are using this as their political basis for even widening the conflicts that beyond what it was.
Thank you for all the questions. And Reverend Dr. Lee, I mean, just this has been a true honor and pleasure to kind of for you to lift up. I think Cal Keith Perry put it best. This is both pragmatic and deeply embedded in some research here that I think this is what our guild is supposed to be doing, is wrestling with this work, both for our own practice as colleagues, as researchers and practitioners, but also what impact we might have on the world. Because as you said it best, lives are at stake. This is a matter of life and death. So thank you. Can we drop some more love for Reverend Dr. Lee in the comments? Celebrate, do the clap. I don't know what the little light bulb moment is, but if you want to have a light bulb, have a light bulb. Just remember you can drop some stuff on Padlet, and you can spend more time with Boyung and myself. If you like our two-person DJ thing we got going here, we'll be doing end of day reflection on all at the end of every day, and we'll be moving over to that session right now. So thank you. Boyung, is there anything else you would like to say before we wrap up here? I am just grateful for the space and to share some of the foundations of my current research. Even though some of our colleagues are more advanced in this area and with their research. So thank you for your generosity. Thank you all, and we'll see you over in the reflection room.